Hello and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun,
Hello, hello.
and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, so we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today, we are happy to have our beloved friend, Dr. Yizhou Ma, joining our podcast. Hi, Yizhou.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, Zongjun. It's very nice to be here.
So just about to call you Ben.
I'm just about to call you Ben, and then I stopped. Well, dear audience, if you hear us address someone as Ben, it means Yizhou.
So we were all actually former colleagues at the last company, and I think you joined right after you got your master's in dairy science, and then during COVID, you went to go pursue a PhD in the Netherlands. So now we can call you Dr. Yizhou Ma, which also is a new name for us.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I'm very happy to very happy to be here and talk about matcha today.
Yeah. So, Yizhou, can you maybe share a
Yeah.
little bit background information about what do you do? What's your academic background? What you're working on, and what's your impression about matcha as a consumer?
Sure. Well, like Ryan said, right? So I started a PhD degree, working on my PhD degree during COVID. I defended my PhD thesis and got a doctoral title. Although, as a person who's a bit of an anti-achiever, so I don't quite refer myself with the doctoral title. But ever since I got my doctoral degree, I started a new position as an assistant professor of food technology at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm housed in two research groups. One is food process engineering, and one is food quality and design. So that speaks a bit of what my day job would be. So doing a lot of work with turning ingredients into food, and also spending time on analyzing the quality of the food and how it interacts with consumers. Yeah, about matcha itself, I would say I'm a very occasional consumer of just matcha tea by itself. I would rarely really consume any of the matcha flavored snacks or other food products, simply because the matcha flavor standards is a little low for the typical consumer product that I would be able to get. And the very occasional drinking of matcha is also kind of tied to the reason that I was thinking about this. I have a daily beverage pie chart, right? So and it's filled with other type of beverages of choice. So sometimes matcha makes into a thin slice of my beverage of choice, but that's normally limited to not having a lot of good access to nice matcha, and also I have to confess that I don't have a very large facility or gears of brewing good matcha. So that's also part of the reason that I normally just get it from cafes instead of brewing it myself.
Interesting. What are some of the fatter slice of the pie in your beverage chart, Yizhou?
Yeah. Well, that certainly goes still to a lot of coffee. Recently, also a growing slice of loose leaf tea, let's say, in general. Yeah, and certainly various alcoholic type of beverages. Good old water. We can't forget about water.
Very important.
Yeah.
Actually, I've noticed too in Europe that the matcha quality is maybe the lowest in the world. In the States, it's also kind of a gamble. But in Europe, even if you go to matcha specialty places, like in Paris, for example, really is disgusting is probably the right word. And they're charging 3, 4, 5, 6 euros.
Whoa,
And
that's crazy.
It's expensive and it's bad.
Yeah, I would agree with it. It's harder to find, and the quality is really hit and miss. Sometimes I make this small observation at some cafes that it's driven more towards coffee, but also serve matcha. I tend to look at the baristas' brewing techniques a bit, thanks to education from both of you that now I can judge a little bit. So I don't order the drink as much, but I do see that's how it's being made in a lot of commercial places.
Apparently, the EU makes it very hard to let in anything that doesn't meet their standards for herbicides and pesticides and organic farming. type criteria, and it's very stringent. And matcha needs incredibly nitrogen-rich soil. Everything likes nitrogen, so you need to use a lot of herbicides and pesticides in commercial farming. There are some people doing much more natural methods, but it's a smaller number and it's expensive. And so most of the stuff that's for more B2B use, like in a cafe, there have actually relatively few options for what would be considered higher quality matcha due to the restricted farming practices.
Very interesting. Yeah, I didn't know this either. That could certainly be the reason then.
You also are a podcaster. You co-host a podcast on food and food technology called Food in the Hood. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for giving me the chance to plug in my own podcast. I have a podcast with my college friend, Amanda Sia, that we talk a lot about food science, its current trends, educational perspectives of food technologies in general, and some of the kind of newer upcoming technologies such as cellular agriculture, plant-based meat analogs, and various other type of topics. Yeah, so we don't really have a production schedule anymore, but we're trying to push out episodes every 2 or 3 months, let's say.
It's a great podcast too. I think you guys do a good job talking about not only the fundamental science, but the application of it in industry.
Quite eye-opening.
Yes, growingly because of both Amanda and I, our roles have changed over the years, right? We really started the podcast in 2018 when we were still graduate students in the US. But now Amanda's quite deep into the food industry as a professional, and I've had a few transitions in terms of academic positions. So yeah, the topics also changed along.
So we got to meet very recently. I was in France and you were in the Netherlands, and we met halfway and met in Antwerp, Belgium. And we got chatting, and you very kindly offered to use a machine that you had to analyze a can of matcha. Could you talk a little bit about what that machine does and the way the analysis works?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so if we're thinking of matcha, by the appearance of it, it's just grind up dried plant tissues, right, in the form of a powder. So a relatively common measure of powder, physically speaking, is its size, right, and its morphology or its shape or how it's looked normally under a microscope. So at our university, we happen to have a device that kind of automate these process by essentially it's a automatic microscope that can look at different fields on a thin slide, right? So what we could do is to disperse by air a thin slice of matcha powder onto a glass slide, and the automated microscopic system will then identify these powders and first take pictures of them and analyze its size, and also save some of this information about its morphology, right? So is it a rod shape, or is it like a shape like a pen, or is a polygon, or is it more like a circle type of shape, right? So that certainly matters, not only for matcha, but also it has a even much wider use in, let's say, pharmaceutical, right? A lot of these active compounds or dried also in powder forms. It's quite important also for milling, right? So to mill a flour, for example, that's also powder that also comes in different shapes and different sizes. So that is what essentially I did for this matcha sample as well.
Compared to other particles, other foodstuffs that you put through this machine, is it extremely fine, or is it like standard to some of the milled cereals or other types of powders that you would come across when doing food research?
Yeah, it's certainly on the finer side of the spectrum. Lot of food powders are range. I will say this is micrometer, right? So that's most of the kitchen ingredient size that we will encounter. For in terms of matcha, we're really talking about 5 to 10 micron, so micrometers, which is on the lower side of powders. So something probably in other type of powders that we're seeing in our life, it's perhaps in the higher 2 digits or to close to 100 or several hundred in micron, and that type of size is more typical to find in powder foods.
Interesting. So to give our listener a little bit background information about this sample, so Ryan brought Ben a little sample of matcha from Hori Shichimenen, and it's from this special blend, Seishi no Shiro. So if you had the chance to procure it online or offline, you're welcome to buy one of these samples and try it yourself to have a better reference of what exactly did we test.
Yeah.
So I would assume, since this is from a traditional house, this matcha is milled from a traditional Ishiyuzu.
Yeah, especially for the price point too.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
from what people have been talking about, so like people would say that any matcha coming from a traditional Ishiyuzu usually has a more jagged powder shape compared to a matcha that was milled from a ball mill. So for a more jagged powdered particle, it usually suspends better in water than a more spherical powder. So Ben, from your observation from the sample using the machine, would you say that this powder is particularly more jagged compared to other powder that you have seen? Or how do you assess the exact morphology of this powder?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Zongjun. The let's say what essentially this microscope does is it picks up these individual particles and take a quick picture of it, right? It's just a black and white picture, and then it tries to analyze its shape. And a common parameter that we can use for these type of shape, it's for these type of morphological analysis, it's what's called circularity. It's how if we look at the multiple axes of this shape, how closely they are equal to each other, right? For example, a perfect circle, no matter which way we draw a diameter, it would always equal to each other. And in fact, well, at least from this measurement, we saw quite of a uniform, let's say, a circularity measure. The mean circularity is about 0.8. So that actually means it's quite high. There's not a lot of, let's say, per se elongated particles. That is only let's say more of a jagged or more like a rod shaped type of morphology. However, it could also happen that there are some roughness on these type of particles that, if we look from a overall perspective, it's still quite of a circular footprint, but there might be, let's say, spikes on them that could further change its morphological features, let's say.
Is there a way to measure that, like the spiky?
Would that call for an SEM, or would it be some other method?
No. The same type of morphological analysis that we can dive deeper into that type of measurements. But then when we are start to look for things like spikes per se, then it becomes a bit more, let's say, more subjective, right? So and perhaps what we do typically is then to have some benchmarks, right? So if we were able to compare two different type of matcha powders or two type of other type of powders that were made from a similar processes, we can then compare and contrast directly from an image perspective to see how they're different, and that's probably a little more objective in that way.
Yeah, natural next step we can offer Ben some other samples milled from maybe the same tencha, but using a ball mill or even using our Sanko mill. And
Yeah.
then we can compare, like how exactly are they different from each other.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to do. I also have very limited knowledge about matcha, so it's difficult to really assess some of these data that we see from a single sample. But at least they give us a very good starting point.
Yeah.
Something that I found very surprising in the data, and specifically when you look at the distribution of particle diameters, is that it's not a unimodal distribution. It's a bimodal distribution with a very small hump well below 1 micron. And then the other much larger peak is around 7 or 8 microns, which was interesting. Why are there so many sub 1 micron particles? Is this type of distribution normal for other milled things like cereals?
Yeah, yes, actually for just a grounded powder, right? So this we didn't do any further separation of this powder. At least I don't think the matcha have done through many other type of separation processes. And it's the same for example, a chickpea flour. Or so we do a lot of research on chickpea and other pulse ingredients. And what we typically see are these type of bimodal or sometimes trimodal type of distributions where one peak could correspond to a specific fraction or specific composition of that ingredient. And for chickpea, that's probably more straightforward. It has a lot of starch and it also has some proteins. And the starch would show up as a different size in general. The starch granules would be at a different size than the proteins, so that you could see actually, yeah, there are two different fractions that you already could observe by just looking at its size. Yeah, so specifically for this the matcha sample, there are very very small particles that we're observing here that's below 1 micron. And one aspect that we should first disclaim is that that small of a size is touching the limit of the light microscopy that what they could really assess and evaluate. So there could be some, let's say, systematic error there for evaluating these small particles. But on the other hand, if we're looking at the data and in trying to interpret it, there are probably a lot of sugars or other type of small molecules that were not part of the cellulose type of average powders that you will see at the larger diameter, but it would be something that's probably more pure, say for example just a sugar or just some other type of organic presence of compositions.
Very interesting.
So this in theory could be driven by like the leafy leaf material or more of the veins, or maybe if some stems got in there, you have some lignin.
Or even like from a very high pressure milling, you probably broke a lot of cell wall and a lot of these compounds or smaller things coming out from inside the cell.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's probably where these let's say smaller molecules were released from. And normally we expect them to be packed together, but they could also be broken off.
Interesting. So when it comes to like bringing this back to the way this can impact matcha and its flavor, when you have particles that are this small, could you discuss in general the process of oxidation of any non-perishable food, let's say like from ground coffee or this or flour, and sort of what's happening there as it gets exposed to the elements and how quickly it can go bad?
Mm-hmm.
Or not bad,
Yeah.
or lose its sensory qualities.
Right. Yeah. Or in some extreme cases, they could just go bad as well. So this is really something that's I think quite unique to matcha as a let's say a specialty drink, or it's also a unique presence in the form of a powder, right? Because we also have a lot of different type of powder ingredients in our kitchen cupboard, right? We could have let's say cornstarch that is in a similar particle size distribution as a matcha powder, but we're not really looking for its, we're not applying it for its pure sensorial perceptions, right? It's normally used as a thickener. So when we have powders at this fine of particle size, we essentially have small particle size so that we have a very large surface area. So with very high surface area, it's prone to be oxidized quicker, simply because there are more contacting points that can be touched by air or the oxygen in air. So that is something quite specific for these type of powder drinks. And in general, a lot of other type of powder ingredients are let's say agglomerated. Instant coffee are not as fine as the matcha powders. So that also can help a bit. Well, it primarily helps with dissolution, but it also helps a bit with reduced surface area.
Makes sense. And to what degree do you think moisture can play a role in degradation of positive sensory qualities, flavors, and aromas? Because a lot of people store their matcha in the refrigerator to preserve it. And then, it's open and they scoop some out and they sift it and then they put it back in the fridge. But there's certainly some condensation going on.
Yes.
Do you think over the course of, 100 grams of matcha, you're going to preserve it as well because of the introduction of moisture? versus having not refrigerated it? Like, what do you, just from like your first principles, how would you think about that trade-off from a scientific perspective?
Right, and this is really just you know, off the top of my head, that I have never really done much of research from a scientific perspective. But if we're just purely talking about first principles and following your train of thought, that first of all reactions, well, most reactions really require water, especially oxidative type of reactions requires water, or water severely accelerates it. Right, so. Uh, Essentially the moist environment in a fridge or some other type of environment that is high humidity certainly would would promote some of these changes. And I would argue that in a fridge is probably is okay because it's lower temperature. But if it is a moisture also at room temperature or normal temperature would also promote a lot of microbial growth. So it's really not nice to have a lot of moistures around powder. Uh, you know, perhaps what I would argue, if you freeze it, right, that you go into a different problem. But then at least you're avoiding a lot of these water impacts when dealing or storing of powder ingredients like matcha.
So freezing
Yeah.
is generally a good idea.
But then, like when you open it every time, it's still, you're going to get some condensation. You reclose it, and then it goes back in the freezer. So it's mostly liquid
Mhm.
water.
Yeah. I mean, once it goes back to the
Exactly.
freezer, will the water will crystallize into ice.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
exactly. Yeah, so there isn't too many good. I would say, yeah, it would just be a very difficult situation to solve, right? That's why, you know, perhaps what, you know, coffee drinkers are now doing is probably very smart with countertop grinders that you just make powders on premise. So to avoid a lot of the trouble with storage, right? So and that's using the nature itself to store. Well, coffee beans are the natural ways of storing beans, right? The coffee beans themselves. So that would probably make more sense to me than figuring out a very complicated type of storage solutions for these type of very sensitive powder.
We totally agree.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
Like these, like these storage degradations is unavoidable for if we're dealing with these type of fine powder ingredients.
Could you talk a little bit about the uh, unintuitive behavior of powders and small particles when you get to the point where a lot of the cohesive forces are so strong that you get things like clump? Because what we've noticed in milling matcha is that in our failed tests, when we didn't put a parameter right, where it wasn't very fine, it was like coarse sand. And one of the ways that we know it's working is actually that it's very sticky to itself. It clumps up, and there's this transition that happens at some point. So could you talk a little bit about like the chemistry and physics of that process in food?
Yes, a bit. Yeah. What you're seeing there is essentially the cohesiveness of those powders are increasing. Right, so essentially, there is more of a physics type of concept called uh, packing volume. Right, so, for example, the volume ratio of the particles exceeds a certain volume ratio of the bulk volume, that you would essentially get more densely packed structures that are kind of similar to you know, a lump of powder in that regard. And a lot of times it's also how there are also other type of forces that could play a role, right? There could be again moisture, right? So that could form a lot of water bridges, essentially, to have a lot of hydrogen bonding to have the powder sticking together. And it could also be static, right? So there are some statics as well. So in general, for the food industry, lumps are not good, right? So a lot of times, what lot of milling experts or grain scientists, what they're trying to do is to minimize as much of these lumps and to have a free flow powder as much as possible. So that really goes a lot with the morphology and the particle size of the powder ingredients. And sometimes also people are placing these flowing aids, right? So some inert particles that would just sit in between of the active particles and to break up some of these lumps.
Oh, interesting. And so for people in the matcha industry, and especially for barista to start preparing a bowl of matcha, they usually would use a sieve to unclump the matcha. So they put the correct portion on the sieve, and then they just sieve it out, and to make a
Mm-hmm.
more uniformic matcha powder. Have you seen any other ways in the industry for other types of powder for people to unclump the powder, or do they all use a similar kind of mechanism?
Yeah, I would say in general it's a mechanical force. So it's sieve is certainly very practical and very good to use. At some industrial scales, when you can't sieve things anymore, if it's too large or too small, sometimes piezoelectrics could be used.
Mm,
Right, to have essentially vibrators to help breaking the particles apart.
interesting.
That is
Hmm.
interesting.
I wonder if we can apply that to matcha.
Yeah. Well, one thing you see the coffee industry doing, like anytime you're grinding anything, you're producing tons of static. So like electrostatic forces cause like matcha and coffee fines to stick everywhere. So you see people using ionizers, which I assume the mechanism there is it produces some ozone. It's basically a free radical, which then helps neutralize some of these charged particles.
How effective is that?
Apparently, it's pretty effective in coffee. I've never heard of anyone doing it in matcha. But I wonder to what degree, if you were to use a deionizer for matcha and produce tons of ozone, are you just destroying all the catechins and health benefits by getting it not to clump or to reduce those electrostatic forces? Or do you think that there's probably way more antioxidants in the matcha than can ever be neutralized by something like ozone?
Yeah, that's difficult to kind of say, right? Without running some experiments or thinking through the specific reactions.
Yeah, well, again,
Yeah, but
first
then
principle guess.
right. Even for first principle guesses, I don't dare to comment too much specifically about how we would really interact with the antioxidants in matcha. But what perhaps we could think of is also if dealing with these lumping problems, whether we have like a grind on promise, right? So to really grind it on premise, that would be a little bit easier to solve than these more long-term type of lumps that's forming during storage. The mechanism, or if we add a temporal time component to it, it would be really difficult to estimate and simulate what would happen to that kind of matcha during transportation, storage, and then finally rich consumption.
That makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah. Then what about James Hoffman's famous like two sprays of water to the beans?
It has a really cool name. Yeah, so it's called the Ross droplet technique, where you spray a little bit of water
Hmm.
to help eliminate the static that gets formed during grinding. I have no idea if that would work with matcha. I have heard that it cannot be too dry of an environment or too humid.
Hmm.
And I think it's around 60% humidity is what is considered the perfect humidity in a relatively cold room to mill matcha. Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know.
Yeah, that could be it. That type of work. It's more, do we again? Do we really need ozone or these type of, let's say, a bit over engineered solutions, or are there other ways that can kind of work around with it to alleviate the problem here?
Can you maybe talk a little bit about foam formation and the stability of the foam from a food scientist perspective?
Yes, absolutely. This actually links very well with the particle size distribution that we were discussing, right? So Ryan asked about the small peak at the very small particle size, the submicron particles, and actually some of those, my suspicion is that they could also be protein aggregates. Right, so and protein certainly is surface active. It is very commonly used to stabilize, or first of all to create foam, and also to stabilize foam in many type of food beverages. That actually would be quite interesting to observe here, right? Because matcha is such a young leaf, right, on the tea to have. So actually younger leaves tend to have a lot of more protein content in general compared to older leaves, just simply because they have more, and these proteins are in the form of enzymes. Right? The enzymes are there biologically to help the tree to grow more. But from a food production perspective, we pick these leaves for other applications that are also a bit higher in proteins. So that could be seen here that the foams are quite nicely set up with a lot of these matcha-based drinks.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I actually have a question to you two about this foam though, because you know way more about matcha than I do. Because when I see this matcha latte type of drinks, do you think that most of the foams are coming from the milk or actually from matcha?
It can come from either. So definitely, like the base latte art is coming from the foam of the milk.
Okay.
But any good matcha that's well prepared, you should have really nice foam contributing to the sensory experience just from the matcha itself.
So then the top part is all milk foam there from the latte art. But then
Yes.
there will be suspended foams in the drink itself that could come from matcha.
Good. Yeah. Or
Mhm.
it's textured milk to begin with, so there could be some suspended air from the if the milk is steamed with a lot of skill.
I see. Interesting.
So they say that matcha is a suspension because we're drinking the whole leaf. Could you put it in like a scientific descriptor of like what makes matcha so unique? Because you compare it to like instant coffee or even normal coffee. It's 100% soluble stuff for the most part. You're not actually drinking the insoluble stuff, but matcha is incredibly unique in that respect.
Yeah, that's something quite interesting. Yeah, when you mention it, like most of our drinks, right? We tend to only drink the soluble part, meaning that it's a solution per se, right? So like the simplest is sugar in water, right? It automatically would dissolve because of thermodynamics. But in this case, for matcha, it's a suspension, meaning that it's not 100% thermodynamically stable, right? So if we leave matcha out, leave the suspension out for a day or longer, it would start to phase separate. The solids will start to sink because of gravity, and the liquid supernatant liquid would be become clear. So that is something. Also, I don't think it's that rare to have. It's just that we don't really have too many of these examples with pure solid particles. Because, for example, if we're drinking milk, there are the proteins in milk are in the form of casein micelles, right? And they're also kind of suspensions of they're dispersions, right? So they're even at a smaller scale of these particles dispersed in the system. So they're not 100% dissolved in the system because they're also not 100% thermodynamically stable. But we're more familiar with those because they are probably a bit more, let's say, commonly found in various milk type of products, so that we're okay with drinking them more easily, or we don't overthink of this process, right?
Wait, so they're micelles. The proteins in milk are micelles.
Yes, the caseins are in
Interesting.
micellar forms. Yeah.
I went to a talk, I don't know, when I was an undergraduate studying chemistry, and they were talking about using micelles for certain type of like ultra-targeted drug delivery systems. And I like very clearly remember
Yeah.
this talk. But,
Interesting.
I had no idea it was a natural phenomenon, that it could be in something like
Yeah.
cow's milk. It's surprising.
Yes. It is a natural phenomena, and we normally take natural phenomena for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah, in many ways, yeah. But then if we think again, I'm just also kind of thinking out loud here, right? Because a lot of let's say freshly made soy milk, certainly there are some particles that are suspended inside of the inside of the drink, the liquid system that were just kind of consumed also with the rest of the liquid, right? So you can argue that it's a complex system that has some part is a solution, and the other part could be also a suspension, right? So there are solid particles included, and if we let that milk, the soy milk, sit overnight or sometime, we do see sedimentations as well. So that is the similar phenomenon that we're seeing here, except probably for matcha, the uniformity of the drink it's much more prioritized.
I've never seen someone produce a successful CPG, consumer packaged good, RTD, ready to drink bottle of matcha. I've had a lot of them. They all have the sediment problem. But, something like soy milk or oat milk, they tend to not have a lot of sediment. Do you think that could be overcome in the tea industry by just using emulsifiers or gums, something like lecithin? Or do you think the particles might just be too big and it's still going to sink?
Yeah, I think it's unavoidable with if it's just water and matcha powder, right? So that, but even with added, let's say, modifiers or technologies, the reason why the drinks are seeing the plant-based milk drinks are seeing more uniform, it's also because that the color or the flavor that's given into the drink came from the fat fractions. So they are stabilized via a emulsion type of mechanism. So that fat droplets are stabilized by these gums or emulsifiers. But it's very difficult to suspend solid particles because they're relatively inert, right? So they don't have
Oh,
other type of compounds that could interact with them well with both the solid and water to really keep them afloat for a long time. So
interesting.
that's probably the reason for any type of matcha drink to have an expected level of sediments on the bottom.
I have a question just to be validated. In Japanese tea ceremony, there's two types of tea that can be served. Something called usucha or thin tea. And the ratio of matcha powder to water is 1 to 30, 1 gram to 30 grams of water. And there's something called koicha, where you cut the tea in half. You double the tea and you cut the water in half. So it's 4 times more concentrated. And there's almost zero foam that can form. It's basically a paste. And the reason there's no foam formation is just because the viscosity is way too high to support that foam. Is that the correct conclusion about why there's no foam? Most likely.
And both type of teas are properly mixed and
Yeah, full suspension. They should be they
full
should be like
suspension.
proper
Yeah.
suspension.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, and also maybe the amount of available water, it that just simply do not. If it's more behaving like a paste, you wouldn't have enough available water for, let's say, protein to unfold or to have the proper interfaces for stabilizing foams essentially.
And I have a follow-up question regarding to koicha. So, do powder behave differently in a usucha kind of very water abundant situation versus a paste situation? Like,
It-
would segmentation happen also very easily if it's a paste, for instance?
Maybe a little bit less if we're thinking specifically for matcha, right? Because if it's a paste, the solid particles actually contributes to part of the structure of the overall product or the drink that you made. Right, because they're also particle interactions, and in a more water abundant or a liquid system, there are less particle interactions, but more particle water interactions in general, right? So in that sense, there could be a difference. And in terms of sedimentation time, that certainly also relies in these type of liquid or semi-liquid systems. It's always viscosity plays a big role, and the reduction of water typically would increase the viscosity of the water phase, simply because there are some soluble fibers in the matcha powder itself, and the more concentrated that fraction is, the higher the viscosity would.
Very interesting. Maybe koicha will be a better CPG product idea. That's more shelf stable.
Yeah.
Not that I really enjoy
Yeah.
koicha.
Yeah, well, that's a high tasting bar. Huh?
The intensity is off the charts.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what it's like too when it becomes a stale product,
Oh my God.
or at least not even fresh. Like I don't know. Yeah. All right. So I guess before we end, do you have any questions for us?
Not too many. I think, yeah, probably just more as a comment that I really enjoyed following your ride and seeing a lot of the development from Sanko, and I hope to see more of to have a chance to analyze more of your products.
Thanks. Actually, I have to give you an extra special thank you, Ben. You were one of the very first phone calls I made in like the first week or two of the idea of the company, trying to figure out and get the confidence of, is this a technically solvable problem? Can you mill matcha fresh in a machine that's in the footprint of something like a coffee grinder? And you pointed us in a lot of very useful directions in the beginning of where to do research and learn about milling science. So owe you a huge thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ben.
Yeah, well, you're very welcome. The ride still continues, right? So I'm very happy
That's
to see
true. And we really appreciate you analyzing the sample. It's very cool.
Yeah, you're
Hopefully,
very welcome.
the slice of pie of your beverage chart will grow bigger in the future as we become more successful.
We need to send you a matcha ball. We'll send you a matcha ball and a whisk. And we'll lower the inertia of preparation to make that pie chart bigger.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. I think that's all we have time for today, but we really appreciate you being so generous with your time. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider giving it 5 stars or sharing it with a friend. And we'll see you on the next one.
Yes,
Thanks.
stay tuned.